All right, looks like we're live again. Welcome back, everybody. I apologize to the viewers that we're a little bit late getting started, but when you have this many people together, sometimes we kind of get sidetracked. So we have pretty much the same individuals involved in this conversation that we had last Wednesday at this time, but we have the addition of Clay Taylor, who's the Executive Director of DPS Officers Association. Welcome, Clay.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And welcome. Also, Travis Hammond, who is first vice president of TMPA and our legislative chairman, is with us, but he doesn't have video, so he's joining us by audio only. So, Steve, I know that you basically have taken point on our agenda so far. Why don't we just keep it that way? Where we go? Where we want to go first?
Well, again, Kevin, thank you. Appreciate this time. It is important, I think, to have the relationship that you and I have had over 20 years serving in the legislature and being a part of the law enforcement field to come together with the African American lawyer section of the State Bar of Texas, I think is a tremendous opportunity for us all. And so I know there's other folks here, Frederick Frazier, as well as Douglas Griffin. And so they've got North and Southeast Texas represented, and the Houston and the Dallas, greater Dallas area. And then our chair of the African American Lawyers Section, Council Member Rudy Mater, and then the chair of our legislative committee, Nikki Christman Green. Kevin, you and I have worked together, so people will know when I was the committee director and general counsel of the Senate Criminal Justice Committee. And I just thought that this was a very favorable opportunity for citizens who have understood law enforcement issues to come together to be proactive and to use the skill sets we've been given and the influence that we have to address very important issues that reflect social injustices and that can move our community in the great state of Texas forward. And it's going to take a collaboration, and it's going to be a marketplace of ideas. And as you mention all the time, we may not agree with everything moving forward, but we'll work through these issues openly and transparently so that we do have a better Texas. So Nikki, I'm going to turn over to you because you are our legislative chair. We have the items for today that we will discuss.
Yes, and so today's, hold on, I'm making sure I'm not an echo. Okay, so today's conversation last week was very, I think it was a very great conversation, very productive, very informative. We had a lot of questions. The F5 process came up. And so I know that we've had other topics that have come up this week with the proposed legislation on defunding and some other items. But what I think would be the best use of time for today is to focus on maybe some follow-up from last week. I know that we intend to continue these conversations. So in the future, I would love to dig into deeper some of those topics that are coming up. I think this is a great platform to be able to discuss both of those sides. But I do want to be respectful of time. And I also want to make sure that we are providing not only informative information, but following up, because we did have a lot of questions that I saw in the chat from our conversation last week. We had some great opinions, and we also had some comments on the process on these F5, the investigation process, and just kind of how misconduct is handled. So I thought we could focus on that. But before we get started, I did want to acknowledge there is an attorney who is he's a criminal defense attorney, a former veteran that had an initiative to walk for reform. And so basically what he did was he took the racial profiling reports, the reform, police reform, and some of the other issues that are out there right now with respect to some systemic racism problems, police reform, criminal justice reform as a whole, some of the data and the trends that is reflected from the racial profiling reports, some of the other reports that are made by police officers with respect to training. And he took that data and he compiled it and he studied it for a long time. And on that disc, I apologize, I got a phone call. On that disc, he intended to discuss these policies with the governor. And so he took off walking from Fort Worth, Texas on August the 9th, had a kickoff rally in front of the Tatiana Jefferson Memorial. And his name is Leon Reed, because I want to say his name. His name is Leon Reed, and Leon Reed walked from Fort Worth to Austin and arrived in Austin on yesterday. And during his walk, he took that opportunity to invite citizens out. He took that opportunity to talk to some of the police chiefs in Temple. He talked to some chiefs in Waco. He also talked to some other police officers, I believe, along the way. I'm not sure of the city, so I don't want to call them out and get them wrong. But not only did he talk, they came to consensus on things, and he explained what he was doing, and they explained their side, similar to what we're doing now. And I say all this to say that when we have an opportunity to engage with one another, even if we don't always share the same idea, it's important that we take that opportunity up. And yesterday, Governor Abbott was in Fort Worth and not in Austin. And I don't want to make this political or get into a debate about it, so I'm going to be respectful. But he had an opportunity to meet with Leon. He was asked about it in the press conference and basically shrugged it off. It was, and I'm going to state my opinion because I have a right to do that, and you guys, can comment and we'll move to the topic. But it was kind of disrespectful. And it was an opportunity where Governor Abbott could have basically have said, I'm not there. I'm in Fort Worth. Didn't get the opportunity to meet you, but what you've done is admirable. Would love to have that opportunity to sit down and talk with you. He did not do that. And so I think that as we continue to engage, we want to make sure that if there's an opportunity where we can hear one another and where we can actually have an opportunity to see where one person is coming from, that we take advantage of that, because it's necessary. And I think conversation is what's going to be the healing and the atonement and the acknowledgement that we need to be able to move forward in all aspects of relationships with police, with the government, with policing, with community. We need to have these open dialogues. And so Leon is still in Austin. So the governor still has an opportunity to meet with him. He is not going to leave until he's met with the governor. And so we just want to wish Leon well. And if there are any police officers or anyone in the area that would like to meet with him, he's currently in Austin, he would be more than willing to do that.
And I want to add on to what Nikki had to say about that, is that I think the key point, just like she said, is missed opportunities. Is we're at a moment of systemic change and momentum in this country, and the only way we're going to get through it, because there's going to be ebbs and flows, is that talking to each other and working together, agree where we can, disagree where we can, but ultimately we have to interact with one another. And in this instance, you had an opportunity to interact, be vocal. There's a lot of people, not just African Americans in this state, but a lot of people across the state were looking for that, just to go across that bridge and do that. I do applaud the governor for, speaking with and working with the Texas Legislative Black Caucus. That's very important. That's fell as well as good. But when you have citizens, people who, he's a veteran. Leon's a veteran. You have folks who literally served their country who are looking to try to see if they can make a discernible difference in a dialogue that is at a crisis point, as we all agree right here with that. We've got to be able to utilize those opportunities and try to make bridges where we can. And I think that, I'm sure there's someone from the governor's office or someone friends of the governor's office watching this as we speak. I would just say, encourages that this is an opportunity. This is not a gotcha moment. This is not a aha or anything like that. This is a genuine opportunity to try to see what we can dialogue and see what we can moving forward on that.
And it's interesting that, the next day we get this opportunity and we let people know, and we gave the explanation that, this isn't a rah-rah section for any of us. This is a working, roll up our sleeves and get things done session. We want to be transparent because we want whomever takes the time to look and listen, that you have serious, concerned individuals representing agencies of change and agencies of the establishment. And I think one of the biggest things that detracts, that I know that I've overcome as someone who is a citizen in this society from the perspective I'm in, is overcoming a fear factor. There's no fear when I speak to Kevin. There's no fear when I speak to Douglas or Frederick or Clay or Travis. When you eliminate the fear of having an inability to interact, you get a much better result. And I'm just praying that there's not fear from political subdivisions of who they're interacting with so that we can get to what makes the difference as people. And that's what I think we took weeks to do before we decided to go live, is to understand that we're not here about threatening or being fearful of each other. It's to be in solution mode, agree, disagree, solve, and move on.
Well, I
Agreed.
would just make points. Obviously the governor doesn't, he doesn't answer to us about what his schedule looks like. So,
Right.
so we couldn't have had any impact on that one way or the other. I would, say that we would welcome the opportunity to talk to Mr. Reed, just like we welcome the opportunity to talk with you guys. Any and all communications we think are helpful. They help move the issue forward. So we're always in favor of that, but we can't answer for the governor or his staff or his schedule. So
He made that very clear to all of us yesterday. One of the topics, so if they're moving on to the next topic, we wanted to address we were talking about the separation of police officers from different jurisdictions, and then their ability to maybe start with another jurisdiction. And we ended on that topic. We didn't have time to really explore it. And during that conversation, there was acknowledgement of an F5 process. And so I noted in the comments that there were some questions on that. I went and studied it and pulled up the form on the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. So it's the separation of licensee, F5. And so I have some questions on that form. And it's funny that when Douglas, you brought up a constable in the area that would give second chances. And we also saw an article that actually came out that talked about, I don't know if it's the same, I can't remember, but the article came out in the news. Me and Steve and Rudy were just looking at that, where it talked about a jurisdiction that was given second chances and that was working with police officers. And so that maybe had, needed that opportunity. So if you could give us a little bit of feedback on this F5 and what is a common ground that we could reach? Because obviously I get the need for a police officer that has not necessarily been dishonorably discharged, because based on the F5, you have an honorable discharge, you have a general discharge, and a dishonorable discharge. And in your comments last week, I think, and someone said that you had to have two dishonorable discharges or two in order not to be able to be reinstated into a license. And so could you clarify that process for us? And so that way we're not saying anything incorrect and we can start our conversation from there.
I think probably Kevin can answer to this better than I can, but I do know the process by which if you have an untruthfulness, an insubordination, that is definitely going to be what they consider a dishonorable discharge from the department, because untruthfulness or something like that is going to get you on a Brady list as well, which makes it where you cannot testify in court to a criminal case. So it makes it hard to retain someone like that. But as far as other, let's say they fire an officer for a chase policy violation. We told you not to get in this chase, you got in chase anyway. That's the chief's pet peeve, they fire them. That would not necessarily be a less than honorable, that would be a general or maybe even an honorable, because it's a policy violation, not necessarily a state law or a truthfulness issue, a Brady issue or anything like that. The guy walks in and says, yes, I violated this policy. This is the reason I did it. And then he could move on down the road to another agency and maybe thrive. So there are different levels of that. And the F5 is kind of a judge for people to look at. General would be, like I said, a policy violation, something that the chief didn't like. Truthfulness, insubordination, stuff like that would be more of the dishonorable.
And the other thing, Douglas, especially coming from a legal standpoint, if you look in statute and a lot of the state agencies, the rulemaking, that truthfulness, the general umbrellas, a lot of times when you're looking at licensees and things of that nature, is called the crimes of moral turpitude. So it's already been kind of summarily used in Texas state law and rulemaking, that if those things are violated, when I was an administrative law judge for private investigators, it's now the Commission on Private Security, you were barred for 7 years if in fact at that time that you had a crime of moral turpitude, lying, cheating, stealing of that nature. And that, of course, as you mentioned, Douglas, is dishonorable.
Yeah.
Now, you can fight. There's a process by which you can fight if you feel
Correct.
that you were, on a step 5 through the TCOL Commission. And I'm gonna let Kevin answer that because I know he had something to say on that.
Okay.
I think he's probably dealt with it more than I have from that standpoint. We have attorneys that deal with that for us, so we really don't do it ourselves. Kevin?
Well, what I was going to point out was, I think Nikki's question is why do they have the standard of 2 dishonorables that result in revocation of the license rather than simply? And I think one of our questions last week was,
Exactly.
audience was, why not automatically on the first dishonorable revoke that license? And there's a couple of different things you have to look at there. One, and as Douglas pointed out, one of the reasons for a dishonorable is an insubordination complaint. Okay. Well, is the fact that you got subordinate one time with your constable or your chief really cause for ending your career altogether? Doug, let me, Steve, if you got insubordinate with your boss at some point somewhere, should you lose your law license? So we're not sure that one insubordination should actually end an officer's career or anybody's career for that matter. There's also the question of whether or not there's truly been due process in this, because as we talked about last week, close to half of the officers in this state work for agencies that don't have any kind of due process whatsoever when it comes to disciplinary actions. They are completely at will. The appeal of the F5 goes to an administrative law judge, so it goes to a SOA hearing, and whether or not that SOA judge actually has the authority to change the F5 is kind of still up in the air. It's, is their job to determine whether or not the officer was actually guilty of insubordination or dishonesty, or is their job to determine whether or not the chief or the sheriff or the constable was telling the truth when he or she said, this is the reason I fired that person? And I don't know that that's terribly clear. And I think if you look at the history of the F5 appeals as they currently sit, it comes down on both sides of that.
That's right, and that's due to the ALJ's belief of what they have the latitude to do, and that's going to vary from ALJ to ALJ.
So yes, we agree, Nikki, that there's a process there that can always stand improvement, but we don't think that it's always crystal clear exactly what the improvements would be or how they would ultimately turn out and affect law enforcement as a whole. I think it's also important to understand when we talk about this whole idea of officers getting second chances and so on and so forth. We have agencies in this state. Remember, we've got 2,700 law enforcement agencies in the state. 600 of them employ a grand total of 1 police officer. A lot of them are paying $10, $11, $12, $13 an hour. They're paying less than Buc-ee's pays. They're paying less than Chick-fil-A pays. And exactly what kind of applicant pool you think they're drawing from at that pay scale? So,
and that's, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was just going to say, but with that broad disparity, between what the Austin Police Department or the Plano Police Department or the Dallas Police Department pays versus what Junction PD pays or something like that, there's a huge disparity there. And so you're going to run this gamut because these departments, they need to hire people. They need to hire people that are in fact licensed, but what kind of applicant pool are they drawing?
So Kevin, along those lines, we know that law enforcement ultimately it's local. So, and that's where they have specific funding. Everything else goes with the applicable municipality, government, or local government. How do you help with that? How do you, you may necessarily applicants would want because of the salary that's attributed to it.
On my end, Rudy's cutting out. He's freezing up on his.
He did. You did the Avengers blip.
Is that something that we should be looking at the state to try to buttress, like they do education at a local level? Is that something that's been proposed before? Has it been? If it has, why wasn't it implemented? Or is it something that?
there have been attempts over the years, and I will tell you, TMPA has been down at the Capitol along with HPOU and DPSOA and the DPA, addressing these issues forever, and attempts to try and raise those standards. So let's face it, if you're going to raise the standards, you got to raise the pay. And if you can raise the pay, then you can afford to raise the standards, but they go hand in hand. But a lot of these jurisdictions simply cannot afford to increase the pay, and therefore they're unwilling to raise those standards because it diminishes the applicant pool that they're gonna get. So any and all idea, we are open to any and all ideas, about how to address this at the state level. We go in front of city councils and commissioners courts and school boards all the time, encouraging them to get their pay up to a competitive level so that they can attract and retain good quality personnel. Sometimes the money is just not there.
So maybe that's where we can look at from a state level. I mean, they're doing it with education, and there's other things with it. And if the governor, as he was articulating yesterday, wants to make sure that law enforcement is, I forgot what his exact words, funded to the necessary levels it needs to be. Well, then if we want to raise our standards, have the appropriate people there, maybe you should put his money where his mouth. So I think it's interesting. I didn't thought about it until you said that.
Back in the 1940s, and I'm going to catch some people by surprise with this, back in the 1940s, when the state was actually creating civil service for police and fire in the state, they also adopted a few other what they call civil service laws. And they're in chapters 142 and 141 of the local government code. One of them is minimum pay for municipal police. And so that statute is still on the books, and it says if you're a city of 10,000 or more but less than 40,000 or whatever, you have to pay a certain amount of money. And then it gets all the way up to the cities the size of Houston. And the maximum, the bracket for Houston is the highest of all those brackets, and I think it says you have to pay a Houston police officer at least $185 a month. So there's a statute out there we could use. It's a little out of date.
Okay,
Well,
no.
I mean, considering that the chair, at least in the Senate, is from Houston, and an attorney, I think he could probably get that elevated. I know he knows some people on the finance committee.
I think the lower end of that bracket is like $135 a month is the minimum mandated by the state of Texas. We have on the odd occasion thrown out the idea of maybe revisiting that particular statute, rewriting it with some more current numbers, but every time we bring it up, we get laughed at. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Rudy, I think something you got to keep in mind is policing is like any other job when it comes to that. I know people look at it different, but it's really not. I have a special needs daughter, and one of the reasons why we chose this area was because of the level of doctors and stuff that were in this area, and they flock to this area because of the job opportunities that are here. Versus if we stayed, in the small town where I grew up in, the doctors wouldn't be there for my daughter, to be able to help her with her issues and essentially keep her alive. So policing is no different than that. People are going to flock to where the money is.
Yeah, I agree with that. But even with lawyering, if someone wants to work for legal aid, they're not going to make the same amount, as one of the big box firms per se.
I mean, Stephen, a lot of prosecutors don't even make that kind of money, right?
Right. But I would say that we would have a standard of care with regard to our professionalism that regardless if we're a solo practitioner, a prosecutor, or, managing partner at a firm, 80, 150 lawyers or more, we still have to have a minimum level of what I would hope our lawyering and our attorneys would have. And again, I know we go through different type and longer training or education, but again, I think we should certainly head that way to let people know that we can improve their overall protect and serve given that. And that may be on a level of more training, because again, regardless of what that paycheck is, if we can take people through you know, you see these teams, and I use sports analogies all the time, and you'll see a big payroll team like the Yankees, but they're getting beat by a smaller payroll team like Tampa Bay, where half their team can be, you know, identified with one guy on the Yankees and his salary, but they have a much better team because they've decided to come together and be more responsive in their craft, that professional sport. I think we can get the same out of lawyers, law enforcement, and other things that are going to be professional that in particular touch, you know, the community, because I think the community is looking for a minimum level of competence from the people that are, you know, serving the community. Somehow their tax base from sales tax or what have you, property taxes, things of that nature, go to pay the salaries. And so in some way, shape, or form, I would hope that with all this here and the legislators, that we could devise something that should be willing to update statutes in the code and hold people in the 21st century to higher standards. We've all adopted the cell phones. We don't stand at the wall, so we can adopt to change when it comes to dealing with our own citizens, I would think.
And how difficult would it be, or would it be an issue? As I look at this F5 and I look at the 3 categories, I almost feel like if we're saying that we don't want to lump all the categories together, maybe there needs to be an additional category added in light of a criminal investigation that is specific to police use of force or abuse of force, or any kind of police, if a police has been charged or held in a police murder, for example. And I'm going to use the Tatiana Jefferson case here in Fort Worth with that police officer. He voluntarily resigned before they could even get the investigation going, right? He's in the middle of a criminal trial. So if I were to look at this F5, would any of his, until his trial is over, since they didn't do an internal affairs investigation because he resigned, would his conduct even fall into one of these 3 categories on the F5?
It would be a general discharge that he resigned while he was under investigation.
And so to me,
would there be an explanation?
Yeah, I mean, given that
would it say that? Even if you check the general denial box, would I have some background except that it's in the mid-level category?
Okay, 2 things there. First of all, department head always has the option of adding comments on the F5 and sending that into TCOL as well. Second of all, any place where that officer would then turn around and apply is required by law to contact TCOL, find and get a copy of that officer's transcript about every place that they've worked and copies of those F5s. Whether or not they do a thorough background into all of those prior employments is up to that agency. Is up to whichever agency is looking at hiring that officer. And that's one of the things we talked about last week. And one of the things that we have been pushing is for a standard that mandates that every agency do a thorough background investigation on every peace officer they hire from the top down.
And Kevin, it sounds like to me, like, because we are all in agreement with that, having that,
we are,
whether it be across the state, but it also sounds like, I'm just going to put it blunt again, what Travis referred to, money. And if we're going to do something like this, then we need to be able to make sure that we have funding, appropriate funding, which, let's be honest, we're capped at 3.5% at the local level. I'll tell you that Fred and I know that all too well. So if we're going to be able to get the funding to be able to do something like that, we're going to need the state support and legislative support for that.
I agree with that to a certain extent, because having done background investigations during my career, it doesn't require a great deal of capital investment to do a good background investigation. It requires time. It requires personnel. It requires somebody who's willing to put in the effort to make that happen. And it's not rocket science. However, if you have again, 601 officer departments in this state, who's doing the background investigation? Because more than likely the mayor of Kempner, Texas doesn't know that statute exists. Sorry, I don't mean to pick on Kempner, but we've had some issues there.
Hey, can I jump in here for a second, Kevin?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So back to the F5, and I had a dose of reality on the F5 many years ago when we had an officer that had a DWI. He actually was a DWI hit and run, very good officer. So I went down there and I went through the process. He had resigned, he quit, he'd moved on, but I wanted to watch the process of what happens to an officer that has something like this happen. And he gets 2 chances to go in front of the board. He obviously didn't show up for either one of them. They put all his stuff on the F5 and it's done. And so when anybody looks at it, they see that he didn't do any of the appeals or have the second chance. And where I'm going with that is this process is it's pretty black and white, where you know what's going to happen because they're going to tell you. They're very blunt about what's going to happen with your future of your licenses. And I've met with the TCOL commissioners and sat with them and had dinner with them and just went over how all this works. It's let's put it this way. Whether you're an attorney or whether you're a teacher or whether you're a doctor, there's all these processes and they're pretty mimicked of how this works. We do have officers that jump from place to place, and they'll have an untruthfulness, but Kevin hit it on the head earlier. You come from a department, you got a chief that doesn't like you, which I know that's hard for some folks to understand, but in policing, you spend a lot of time together, especially one-on-one. And if you PO somebody that's in a town that's friends with that chief and you arrest them or whatever, well, you're on that list and then you're done. And he's going to get rid of you. He's going to find a way to get rid of you. And he usually uses your license to do that. So, and that's the bad part about our job, is that you have these officers that work for these smaller agencies and they drift. It's not as common as you think, but it is as common as you think. It's hard to explain that. You'll have an officer that's worked somewhere for a sheriff's department for 5 years and then moved on to a big city. That's pretty common. For officers to jump around all the time, that's not real common. I've been in one place the entire time. I know that most of the folks I know have been to the same place. I know Doug's the same way where he's at, and I know Travis is the same way where he's at. But in other instances, you'll have them jump around. And when you have the F5, and usually, it's like a DWI or family violence or a theft or disorderly conduct, and you have these, they have to go in front of it. And, there's some of them where cases that are, I can't say the DWI, but the family violence and some of the other disorderly conducts, they're going to have to go in front of a criminal judge. And sometimes they're just sitting there waiting for that to happen. And sometimes it happens and they get the charge. So it's a play. I guess what I'm trying to say is my suggestion would be, have you guys reached out to TCOL to have that conversation with them on how the process starts from, A to Z?
And the thing is, we wanted to start here.
Okay.
Before we spun out. And again, I've worked with them, and I forget, Kevin, the former executive director, Tom, is it Tommy? I forget the gentleman. He was there for forever. Retired maybe 10 years ago or so.
I know you're talking about Timothy Bratton. Yeah.
He's gone.
I dealt with him being in the committee, and there was a very fluid back and forth. Didn't have I don't think the necessity like we do right now to kind of have the understanding to work with TCOL in the same capacity. Nonetheless, now, Frederick and Kevin, I think we have a very viable rationale and necessary reasons to engage them and say what we're saying, because I don't want TCOL to think that someone's just all of a sudden heisting them out of nowhere. This comes from very educated dialogue and some things. Because what's this state bar section coming over, coming at us about? It's like, well, no. It's very, very pointed and direct in regards to what we're seeking to accomplish. And I think, again, that's why we do this. There's the safety and strength in numbers of having the groups come together. So it's not a renegade or a rogue scenario that someone's coming to a state agency seeking to speak with an executive director about something that is very standard and widely used statewide, and going, what are you looking at making changes, and who are you? So, we wanted to start here first, and then we'll seek the solutions. And if going to state agencies and having those types of meetings and giving a rationale of why we're speaking to you in regards to your forms and whatnot, I think it comes with, background and also substance, as opposed to just something that's very random to that agency.
And
Yeah,
so,
and
And I also think there's value in understanding the process, so that way, as we are proposing the changes, we understand how the process is working right now. Because when I look at this form and I look at these 3 categories, just knowing how the officer that we just talked about that did wind up killing Tatiana Jefferson, how would that look on this form? How would that categorize? That helps too when you're trying to explain it to the community and you're trying to say, this is what we need to propose, this is what will work, and this will not work. And so we have a general understanding about what goes on the form, how the form looks, and how that information is tabulated. One more question, and then I think somebody else had something. Is this form available through a public information request on an officer? Can we get a copy of this FI?
only under certain circumstances, only if the officer has been accused of or has been terminated for specific allegations. Otherwise, if it's excessive force or dishonesty, I believe those are the 2 categories that are actually available through open records request. I want to get back to the conversation about TCOLE, just so we're all clear. The most recent meeting that we had with TCOLE about the F5, the push at that point, and I think TCOLE was on board with it, and it was coming from the chiefs and sheriffs, was to change the F5 to strictly a separation report with no reason given. Simply, this officer is no longer here, done. And while I understand, and HPOU was actually in agreement with that, but then Houston's got a very detailed due process system in place. So does Dallas. A lot of agencies in the state don't. So the problem with that is that leaves, A, the officer with no recourse whatsoever, and B, it leaves the next agency that they go apply at completely unsuspecting. So our argument was we would have been okay with that if it included a provision that said, but the next agency is mandated to do a thorough background investigation. That agency is required.
A trade-off.
Yeah. The thorough background investigation, in our opinion, is the absolute linchpin here. It is the most important part of this process.
No, I would completely agree with you on that.
Well, and there's the other thing. I mean, even for lawyers, if you have a public reprimand and different things like that, you can see with regards to our license, the varying levels and degrees of, all the way up to disbarment or suspension and things of that nature. I would think that you could do the same thing for a law enforcement officer, and to say that all they're just going to do is put on their, a general summation. I don't think you would want to hire any legal representation just knowing there was just, that limited amount of information of that practitioner when you would go to seek them for counsel. I think you'd want a little bit more.
Two things on that. If we're talking about creating a statewide system that guarantees these officers due process, where they get a full vetting in front of God and everybody, count us in. Because we're all good. We talked about this last week. That's why we have always pushed for processes that are completely open to the public, where anybody can come sit in and listen to these appeals, listen to the disciplinary process. Because let's face it, if it's a bad cop, we need them out of the business. But if they're a good cop and they just got caught up in cronyism and politics, the citizens suffer if we start running those folks off, because then we don't wind up with good cops out there on the street. We wind up with people that are political puppets, like it used to be back in the 1940s in Houston. So, but we would be good with that as long as it includes meaningful due process.
So Kevin, then it sounds to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in my assumption, that you would agree that I think in our proposal, or what we've discussed, is we really need to look at the way that these, not just misconduct, but the police complaints as a whole are handled internally, and how they are answered to, because there seems to be a discrepancy or not uniformity in how police complaints are handled within different departments, internal affairs, investigations, especially use of force, and just different complaints so that they get that there's a problem with how they are investigated and how they are handled and how they come to resolution. Is that a true assumption that you do have concerns with that too?
Well, whether or not there's a problem depends on the department. So we got 2,700 departments we'd have to take a look at.
Yeah.
A lot of departments do an excellent job, do a wonderful job. And I will make this argument all day long. Tell me another profession that does as good a job as law enforcement in general of investigating and policing their own. But yes, that's true. There is no single standard that is applied across the board. And even if there were, in a system where you have, for example, a sheriff who's a constitutionally elected official, whether or not that sheriff can be bound by whatever those standards are is also problematic. It may require a constitutional amendment. We've got a sheriff who was recently appointed to fill an unexpired term because he had already won the primary. So he was going to wind up taking over in January anyway. So when the current sheriff went ahead and resigned, the commissioner's court went ahead and appointed him. The first thing he did, 12:01 a.m. after he got sworn in, was fire 17 people because they didn't support him in the election.
I've seen that happen. I've seen that happen as well in the district attorney's office. And so,
yeah, but how does that work? How does that work with lawyers? I mean, because again, you know, we're an at-will state. So that means you do have flexibility, whether you're the police chief or the DA. You know, you have that option because you're the one that won the election. But at least there can be other circumstances outside of that you can, and there are, I think, recognizing and recognition that if I went somewhere else because I didn't support DA in Travis County, I could work in Hayes or Williamson County. I'd have to drive maybe a little bit farther, but they're not saying I'm a bad, you know, assistant DA or county attorney, whomever, you know, they work for, but, you know, I got let go because I didn't support that office.
But that's not what he put on the F5s.
Right.
so then so I mean that alludes to a bigger problem, and that's one of the concerns that we have, and it can always be political. So I get what you're saying there. You can't stop somebody that's going to do that. I've had good friends that have lost their jobs as the prosecutor when the new administration came in or the new DA came in. So I mean, it's a part of life. And I don't say that to be, you know, disrespectful or just, you know, casual about someone's job, because that is important to them, but it happens. And I think that, like Stephen said, you still have to have some kind of standard system. And I understand what you're saying about having different departments and different ways that they handle it. But I also know from just our research and just from talking with people out in the community, even from Fort Worth, from the things that we've dealt with, there is a huge problem with the way that police complaints are handled and the way that the misconduct investigations are handled, which I think is a big reason for a big outcry for civilian oversight boards as well.
You had mentioned that everybody now is a part of the National Fraternal Order of Police. Do they have any kind of,
anyway?
Okay. Yeah. Do they have a standard of how you know, have they proposed, you know, we have model rules that come from the American Bar Association that can go nationwide on different topics and subjects. Does that Fraternal Order of Police, do they have some model standard of investigation rules or processes that can be adopted by everybody to create some uniformity from within? Because y'all are your own subject matter experts, kind of like the lawyers are, and we have a disciplinary, you know, arm of our state bar as well.
There actually are. There's several different entities, FOP being just one of them. There's also the International Association of Chiefs of Police. There's CALEA, and Doug or Travis will have to tell y'all exactly what CALEA stands for, but it's an accreditation for law enforcement agencies. There's a couple of different ones, companies, entities like that as well. So yeah, there are boilerplate best practice policies out there that are available. How many agencies have actually adopted them is, anybody's guess.
Can we do that though on a state? Can we look at some of these and come and say, listen, we'll take them from the list of the subject matter experts that are in law enforcement. Can we create from these different groups something that we put together for Texas that we would say would be a minimum standard for it, reasonably speaking, from cut and shoot Texas to Houston, Texas?
Well, that's what I was about to say. If you have the same standard across the board with regard to protections for the officers and their rights, then the F5 would mean a lot more at the end of the day. And that would be important to everyone, because then everybody's playing on the same field.
Right.
Same rules apply across the board. That would be beneficial, I think, to everybody, if I'm not mistaken, Kevin. And on top of that, then when you start realizing how these other agencies do it, like us, we have an independent police oversight board. We have another board on top of that called the ADC, which is the Administrative Discipline Committee, which involves the chairman of those boards, as well as officers on the department. That we can send any investigation, we can see the entire investigation. That investigation is then, if we have a question or a citizen has a question, the Independent Police Oversight Board has a question, it goes back to Internal Affairs to have that question answered. So if we had, again, across the board fairness on investigations and the officers' rights, we'd never have an issue with this.
Well, then maybe that's the key. I mean, that sounds like we're coming from different vantage points. We're coming to the same point, which is that, yeah, I mean, if we have that ubiquitous standard that works, but everyone knows what the rules are to the game, and so therefore, you know, everyone's on the same page regarding what the expectations are, both, you know, before and after the fact, that's something that we all can have common ground on. Steve, I really like your idea and approach about having the SMEs have already put up that standard. Let's look at that list and see what we can do.
Yeah, no need to reinvent the wheel.
But I think with having that standard, like you said, if everybody is operating from the same field, you're going to get transparency on both sides, because you'll be able to watch that process and everybody will know what to expect. So I would agree with that.
And it goes back to something I said last week. If you have a good investigation and you have proper discipline imposed, you don't have arbitrations. That's just the way it is. So if everybody played on the same field and did things right, we wouldn't have these kind of issues.
And transparency through the process. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And Doug, just like you said last week, because that was an interesting juxtaposition between at will and you know, the arbitration standard for different police departments. That maybe that's a financial carrot we can start to utilize to make sure that people actually do work toward a specific standard instead. Because hey, if you're saving cities money from having to go through arbitration and everything else from there as well, you can put some more money into the vetting and the process and making sure we have a playing field where everyone's cognizant of the issues, rules, and concerns, and the transparency.
To get back and answer Steve's original question, yes, Steve, we could adopt that. Get back to your old debate class about the should-would argument, though. You know, when we tried to pass a statute that said cops had to be able to read and write to get licensed in this state, you wouldn't believe the opposition we were up against. The executive director of TCOL before Timothy Bratton was Jim Dozier. Jim Dozier made a proposal at a conference one year that we should require a college degree for anybody to be a peace officer in this state. And he actually said, let's say we're going to do it 20 years from now. Let's create the pathway right now, and it won't be effective for 20 years. And that was a big reason why he left as executive director, because of the opposition to the notion. So when I start talking about stuff like that, it's not because we're opposed to it. It's because we're going to meet opposition to it. And it always comes back to money. It always comes back to money.
I think training definitely comes back to money, but uniformity can be agreed upon. And I think that would bring, again, that takes the fear of the unknown out of the circumstance, because we know if you're in far west Texas and El Paso, Texarkana, Houston, Lubbock, Brownsville, Houston, you know, Austin, San Antonio, wherever, they're operating under the same format and pretense.
Minimum set of standards, right? Mm-hmm.
That has to be somewhat comforting, because then you can know and educate the community, bringing people together, like you mentioned, and I think rightfully so. Just don't have the officers there when there's a call or a dispatched call, but have them communicating and interfacing with the community, you know, for Blue Santa and different things of that nature, where then it's not an adversarial relationship of sorts, but it's a necessary and it's an understood relationship. We're here for a purpose.
Except that somebody has to enforce the standards. I absolutely having the standards, like I say, they're already out there. There are a number of different model policies that are out there. Enforcing them is where somebody has funding and the resources.
We've had model rules for attorneys, and they'll stay model until someone adopts them. No one's going to jump. Not everybody across the board is going to jump on the model rules, even on our level and in our profession, until, you know, State Bar says, okay, we've adopted these model rules from the ABA or whomever, and now they're implemented starting September 1, 2020. Until then, yeah, it's great. You can shoot for it if you want. If not, you know, you can kind of hit or miss. But I think given the circumstances of what we're dealing with, I think having it actually put into place. And again, I think now we have the opportunity to look and create from these lists what makes sense for us in Texas that's palatable, and it's a good start. Give us some minimum standard that we're all working with, even if it's a handful. It's better than just having it out there from these different organizations as a, oh yeah, they're there, but they're not really used in all of our communities.
I will point out we're getting up close to 11 o'clock.
Okay. I think, again, I just want to thank you guys. This has been, as always, like last week and this week, I think it allows us to be able to be informed on the process, to gather information, and to make sure that we're making informed statements and legislative proposals. I do think that we have to be careful when we're just throwing out words. I saw one of your posts that talked about that the other day on TMPA, because you do need to make sure that when you are educating the community or communicating with anyone, that you want to make sure you're knowledgeable about what you're saying and that you're not just putting out misinformation. So this process, I think, allows us to be able to garner both sides, to look at that. The F5 conversation, I think, is definitely one that has been very helpful to me, and hopefully those that are listening. I see we have some listening, but not questions, that they were able to take this, because I know that I'm taking this information and bringing it back to our community, so that, and our lawyers, so that when we are finalizing that legislative proposal that will go next year, we have the right information. So thank you for your time.
All right, we will look forward to seeing you guys next Wednesday, same time.
Yes.
Same bat
Yes.
time, same bat channel.
All right. You guys have a good day.
Appreciate y'all.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Have a great day too.
Thanks, guys.
Just no Bat Tuesday, okay, Kevin? No Bat Tuesday.
Hey, and Rudy, ubiquitous is one of my favorite words. I picked up on that. I just wanted to give you, I like that one.
Rudy, can you get a bigger profile picture, please?
Okay. Fred, we're keep talking your smack. We got to cover this sometime later.
Y'all are funny. Bye, guys.
Yeah.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
Still live, be careful.